Hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Simon Hodgkins, and today I'm happy to introduce to you James Louttit. James is the founder and lead trainer at a company called Impactful Project Management, PMI's Project Management Professional of the Year, and the award-winning author of Leading Impactful Teams. James, welcome to VistaTalks.
Simon, thanks ever so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, let's get into it, James. You've worked in many leading organizations. I'm going to name drop a few. Tesco, which is a giant powerhouse, CPL, which is known to many, and Accenture, which is known the world over. And you've worked in many of these organizations, but you've got a bit of a personal story, which if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you about first, because you talk about going from burnout to actually building a thriving, sustainable approach to project delivery. And that's kind of an interesting place to start. Would you mind sharing some information about that for our audience?
Yeah, so I started my career in consulting and travel and worked with lots of different clients, and I was a bit technical and a bit testy and a bit project managery, and I built my career over years. And in 2016, I was a senior manager in a big consulting firm, as you say, and running a big program. And I was delivering what I would call I was following the process that was there. And I was working really, really hard. And over the course of a week, I went from a headache, which started on the Monday morning, through a series of pretty extreme experiences. And by the end of Saturday lunchtime, I was very, very sick in hospital. And I won't use some of the terminology because I kind of describe it in detail in my in the forward to my book. But suffice to say, I was putting a huge amount of pressure on myself and working really, really hard, really not looking after myself well enough. One of these things that a lot of us ambitious people, have a tendency to do. And it hurt. It hurt a lot. And when I came back from that, I was in hospital for 9 days, and I wasn't allowed back to work for about 3 months afterwards. And everyone was kind of very concerned about me. And I was able to renegotiate my role. And so I became what we call the head of project management competency for a big bank here in Ireland. And my job was to figure out all these genuine challenges that people were struggling with them, right? So I had people who were much more experienced and senior than me dealing with even bigger, more complex projects and coming to me talking through their challenges. It turns out that none of them were solved by the methodology. Uh, so we started to get into all these much more interesting conversations about things like prioritization, about things like building capability within teams, about difficult stakeholders and how to deal with them. And I started to think about training. And I did some training with that role for a couple of years. And then I got a phone call from a headhunter. They'd seen what I was up to, and they said, "James, are you interested in applying to be Chief Information Officer of CPL, which is €500 million company over here in Ireland? It's bigger than that now." And I said yes. And then I realized I didn't know how to be a CIO. So I went and bought 3 books on how to be a CIO and read them. And I nailed the interview and got the job. And then obviously going from a training role into a delivery role and having to deliver value for the organization, I started to put some of this stuff into place that I'd been teaching. And it really made a massive difference. And I had the confidence by that stage, because I talked about it so much, to actually implement things like transparent prioritization, things like business value estimation, and simple things, but really impactful things. And it turned the team around, and we became very successful. And the team actually started winning awards and delivering better for the business. And my management style involves a good amount of what I call coach and delegate. So the goal is to build the capability of the team, not just to do the task that's in front of us. And if you do that, actually, as a leader, you can go down to a 4-day week, I found out. And that's when I got my opportunity to sit back and think about what I wanted to do longer term. And I went and found this amazing cartoonist and started drawing these pictures and cartoons and explaining things in slightly different ways than most people explain them. And turns out there's a massive audience for that. I left CPL in the summer of 2022, got my head down and wrote the book. And now I work with organizations across Ireland and starting to be globally. I've been to Africa and to the UK, and we're starting to engage with the US around around how to actually, deliver work projects and outcomes better, as kind of humans, with some tactics and approaches that are sort of easy to implement and easy to follow, and don't require a huge amount of knowledge or following a process.
Great, James. Thanks for sharing that. And you've got a lot of experience. You've worked with some very large organizations, and you've also consulted with many well-known brands and companies. And I want to talk a little bit about being people first, because I know you talk about the people first sort of philosophy, right? Working with people, but also for our audience, when you're working with companies where people are spread out across cultures, across languages, you're working with different teams who've got maybe different styles, different backgrounds, different upbringings. How does that sort of people first philosophy work when you're dealing internationally? I mean, your own company now is starting to go more and more international, right? So
Yeah.
how does that work when you're trying to advise companies that, like you've done in the past?
Yeah. One of the first things, I was very lucky early on in my career. I had a long commute through the middle of London on a motorbike, and I had an iPod. If you remember the iPods with the little circular thing on them, and I had Dale Carnegie's "How to Win Friends and Influence People" on repeat on this iPod, and I listened to the thing about 10 or 15 times over and over again because I was riding a motorbike. You couldn't stop and change the thing, and the thing that he focuses on, the main element of that book, is how do you put yourself in the other person's shoes. Fundamentally, that's the mindset shift that so many of us struggle to do because we're under so much pressure. We don't have time. We've got our own priorities. And our ability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes becomes the fundamental skill that we can hang our hat on. Now, that becomes harder when those other people are not from your culture, or have other differences, age, gender. These are all kind of angle in and make it a little bit harder, for somebody to put themselves in your shoes and for you to put yourselves in their shoes. So for me, I like studying, different types of people. I recently read Erin Mayer's book, The Culture Map, and I thought it was fantastic for that understanding of different cultures, not just on a very simplistic level where you've kind of got these stereotypes and things that you kind of know about certain people. We can all think of a stereotype about some culture, but actually she breaks it down into like 8 different ways of thinking about the cultures and kind of where people are on a map, or different cultures tend to be on a map. And I think playing that, reading that is really useful. And then also understanding the person and their role. So there's the cultural element, the person, like, so maybe you're analytical or driver, you've heard of some of those kinds of Myers-Briggs type things, but also the role that they're playing and therefore their behavior in that role. Yeah, it's nuanced, but fundamentally break it back down to how can I put myself in the other person's shoes.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And the culture map, yeah, you referenced that. I mean, there's an awful lot of great information in that book. And I suppose it fits nicely with what I want to ask you next, James, which is about, obviously, with localization and globalization projects, these often involve quite diverse teams, linguistic experts being, one of that, living in country, working on large accounts, working with lots of copy and content. You can be spread across multiple time zones too. What about the leaders in that? Because I know you spend a lot of time working with leaders. How do they create, I suppose, what I'm asking is the clarity, the shared purpose? How do they communicate that when maybe cultural norms, languages, expectations, they vary so widely, don't they, when you're communicating and evaluating and leading and deciding and motivating? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that, James?
So you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of variation across cultures. But there are some quite simple things that we can do to give that clarity. So if you think about um, different cultures, right? So maybe a German culture might be quite direct, telling you what to do, this, and this. And actually, a lot of other cultures, particularly in the East or in kind of Africa, tend to be indirect and much more sort of roundabout about the way that they say things. Fundamentally, both of those things are compatible if you've got a bit of structure that you can use to bring the clarity. So my favorite piece of structure is a prioritized list. Just a list of all the things that we're going to do, or all the things that could go wrong. Those are the two best prioritized lists, but there are other ones. But let's say all the things that we're going to do, and what's the number one most important? What's number two? What's number three? What's number four? What's number five? And clarity over those. Because if you don't actually make those decisions about what's more important than something else, and how you get to those decisions can be done in different ways, and again, different cultural nuances on that. But once you get to that, a clarity over what the priorities are, all of a sudden people kind of have a place to stand, and they can point to and talk about that sort of objective prioritization. And it's such a simple tool. It's really powerful.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And look, we mentioned some of the big firms that you've worked with and obviously advised, but you also work with, I suppose, startups, well-funded, people looking to go international. And there's different types of project management. There's different methodologies, right? Agile
Yeah.
and waterfall and Scrum, and we all hear all the words and the processes. But do these, how do they work effectively in that multicultural scenario then?
Yeah. So for me, I think there's the more process, the less well it's going to fit for multicultural. I think almost inevitably, this idea that you can define a process, a really heavy process, something like Prince 2, very process driven, and then just apply that generically across the world, leaving out all of the nuance and all of the understanding. So for me, for those teams working multiculturally, and this is just generally good advice, actually, because the difference between people is probably often more than we think it is to try and simplify your structures down, to try and have less process and allow um, more creativity or more interaction with people. Now, that's not to say you don't need some process, estimating things, planning things, those things could be important, but it's understanding why you're doing those things and getting rid of, in most, particularly big organizations, probably got 90% too much process. And the thing with the process is, particularly in the public sector, actually, is people rely on the process and they become what I call apparatchik project managers. And they're just following the process. Imagine kind of back in Russia in the 50s, and you're following the process, because if you don't follow the process, then you're off to the gulag, right? You'll be sent to Siberia. And sometimes the process takes over, and we don't necessarily empower our people. And I think the more we can empower people wherever they are, the easier things get, the better relationships get, that our ability to build a capable team over a medium and long term, which is really where value comes from, increases. So yeah, less process, more empowerment would be my sense.
Sounds good. I like that. And I suppose it brings me nicely on to something called the PM Hub, the new impactful PM Hub,
Yeah.
because you're sort of bringing together, aren't you, practitioners from all over the world, I suppose. And how is this cross-cultural collaboration, if I can use that term, in this space? Is it helping members solve these real world delivery challenges?
Yeah, the idea. So it's called the Impactful Project Management Community. It's on a platform called School, SKOOL.
Right.
And we haven't really launched it. We're kind of relaunching it in September. But the idea is to teach a toolbox of skills and ideas and approaches and open it up. So it's not just learning, it's also discussion. There'll be drop-in clinics, all that kind of stuff, because I don't think you can, I think learning nowadays just by watching YouTube videos is okay for some things and for some people. Like I watch a lot of YouTube videos and I consume a huge amount of content. I think most of us need to talk about stuff to learn it. And I think that kind of discussion, even if it is online, and it kind of has to be often in a global context, even if it is online, it can really drive a better understanding. And then you're building relationships with people, in different parts of the world as well. So that's the idea behind the community, is to generate a discussion. And yes, there's training in there. There's my sort of flagship 2-day training course. There's a load of career tips. There's all that kind of stuff, which we'll work through. But the idea is to work through it together.
And just a follow-up question to that, because as you were talking, it made me think though that is it just a community for PMs, for project managers managing this, or is everybody a project manager these days?
Well, it's an interesting point. I would argue, and I think I argue in my book, that pretty much everybody is a project manager. So while the skills and approaches, and the other thing that I find is people often get boxed into a certain role, right? So you're in the PMO, the project management office, which means you're kind of all about the admin, or you're a project manager, which means you're all about the Gantt charts and the risk logs, or you're a change manager, right? And they're quite rare, which means you're all about the people and listening and all that kind of stuff. And my point is those three things and everything to the side of them, and a general manager and a leader and all of those, they all come together for success in a career and for success in a project. So you kind of have to take the hats off and accept the fact that you're going to have this broad role if you want to have a successful career, and learn all of those tools and approaches and bring that across. The thing is, when you define project management broadly like that, everybody is one. So what I find is you're almost a lot of the people that read the book or listen to the audiobook, while the project management community get huge value out of it and we get geek out on Gantt charts and that kind of stuff, the simpler ideas and applying some of these techniques really apply to a huge range of people. So I get comments from all kinds of people that are positive about what we're talking about.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the book then. So leading impactful teams, I know is probably used internationally at this stage with lots of people taking the great advice that's in there, people particularly involved in managing projects, whether it's projects for customers, whether it's projects within their own organizations. There's an awful lot in there. But is the differences in different regions in the way that you go through that in the book, or the way that you teach when you meet with people in your community? Or do you adapt your approach, I suppose is what I'm saying? Or is there some fundamentals that everybody just needs to follow, regardless of where they are?
Yeah. So I got an email from my publisher the other day. They're going to translate the book into Chinese. So that's really interesting for me because I don't have that much exposure to the Chinese culture. So I don't know would be an answer to that question. But what I find when I do the training courses, and we've had people from all over the world through the training course, the very first thing I do, once I've shown everyone where the fire escapes are, is I get everybody to ask a question. What would you like to get from this training course? So people will have gone in with whatever expectations and ideas and things that they are coming from. And I get those questions out on the board very, very early. And what I see is, yeah, I haven't actually done the analysis. I don't know if more of a certain type of question come from a certain type of, culture. But what I do see is very broad themes that come up in the questions. How do we prioritize things? How do I say no? How do I deal with I'm not going to swear on but someone who's not behaving particularly well? Like these kind of topics come up over and over and over again from all kinds of different people. And by doing that at the beginning of the course, what I do is I ground the expectations of the course in the people in the room, right? The people who are there. And now I can kind of go back to that regularly as we touch on things throughout the session, and point to that and say, you were talking about how to plan out and how to use planning tools. Great, here's how we do that, and I tick that off as we go through. By the end of the 2 days, I've ticked off all of them. Funnily enough, there were two changes that I had to make over the course of the last year or two to my training course to make, because there were questions that kept on coming up. One of them was about managing remote teams, and the other one was the one we talked about around culture. So with the remote teams, I kind of talk about this idea of building trust. And with the culture one, I actually sometimes talk about Erin's book and bringing some of that nuanced cultural understanding into the room.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. You were recognized, I said at the start, James, that you were recognized by PMI, right? Project Management Professional of the Year. That's no small
Yes, in Ireland. In Ireland. This wasn't a global thing.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, you were still top of the heap. And did that help in sort of the work that you do? Does it encourage organizations to start thinking about this people-focused delivery that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think any kind of credential, particularly when it comes from a globally recognized organization like the PMI, it gives people a comfort that perhaps this guy does know what he's talking about. And while I'm telling stories and anecdotes and I've got cartoons, it is all grounded in a deep understanding. I think that recognition from the PMI that actually I am, and I think the Irish Management Institute of kind of, I do a training course there. They've called me Ireland's leading expert in project management. I'm happy to take that moniker, and I'm happy to talk to the other people in that space as well. Because I think you have to credentialize yourself. You have to show that you know what you're talking about to have the senior conversations and to be able to convince people. It's quite difficult for most of us in our careers to get that cultural change in our organization, wherever we are, top down or bottom up. So I have a lucky position that I get to come in as the expert, recognized by lots of different organizations, and have a chat with at the top and all the way down the organization, and understand where everybody's coming from and generally start to make changes there. So I think it helps with credentializing. I do have my some interesting challenges around some of the certifications and things in place out there. I do think, like, one of the things that the PMI still teaches Moscow prioritization and estimating durations, and I think they're two of the fundamental biggest mistakes actually that a lot of people make, but I could get into why. But there are some mistakes, I think, in the nuance of what some of these organizations teach, but fundamentally their heart's in the right place and they are trying to do amazing things and reduce stress in teams and projects.
Thanks, James. Yes, and the other moniker will certainly be adapted by you for sure. So that's good. That's good. Look, when it comes to international projects and particularly localization, of course, but stakeholders can sometimes have competing or different sort of requirements or priorities, can't they?
Mm.
And it can get quite convoluted, I suppose. Is there any strategies that you would deploy in terms of helping balancing those sort of differences or those different competing priorities to keep a project delivery on track?
Yeah, definitely. So that's probably one of the biggest questions that certainly my biggest client I work with, to actually help them understand the prioritization decisions that they have to make. And the way that we do that is by we have our prioritized list, but actually we also look at value and effort. So when I was lying back in the hospital bed back in 2016, my brother's kind of cool. He's got a big beard and long hair. He's a bit of a hippie. He plays the guitar and he makes harps for a living. And he sent me this video of him playing the Bare Necessities from the Jungle Book. And Baloo the bear in it, he says, when you pick a pawpaw or a prickly pear, if you prick a raw paw, well, next time, beware. Don't pick the prickly pear with a paw. When you pick a pear, try to use the claw. But you don't need to use the claw when you pick a pear with a big pawpaw. I won't sing anymore. And what he's talking about is value and effort prioritization. So actually, if you can explicitly pull out from people the value of the thing that they're doing and put it in an objective number, and for me, that's very often money. Some organizations, it's other things, but for most organizations, it's fundamentally money, and the effort of how hard something's going to take, and use those as a bit of a guide for your prioritization discussion, and then go back to your prioritized list and say, well, this is a high value, low effort thing, so it should be near the top. And this is a low value, high effort thing, so it should be near the bottom. And that allows us to change the dynamic of me being the political important person going, I want my thing, and banging my fist on the desk, and someone else doing the same thing, and we just go to loggerheads. And all of a sudden, I can look at your calculations and you can look at mine, and we can discuss and estimate and change the assumptions and whatever. And instead of it being you against me, it becomes you and me against the problem. How do we solve the prioritization answer for the organization that's going to be in the best way for the organization? And that takes a huge amount of the sting and the politics out of some of these very fractious discussions. Often. So for me, I think a prioritized list with just an estimate of value and effort, and even if that estimate is imperfect, as long as it's transparent, then actually that creates a lot of better value for the organizations.
Taking the sting and the politics out sounds wonderful. I like that. Fully endorsed by the Jungle Book. Yes, 100%.
Indeed.
Look, before we run out of time, I want to squeeze one more question in. As you look ahead, and obviously you continue to work with these organizations on project management and everything in between, are there any trends you're keeping your eye on? Is there anything that you think is going to influence how projects are managed as we go forward, particularly with that international slant, across borders, across languages? And how should we be preparing or thinking about the future of project management, James?
Yeah, well, I'm going to skip AI because everyone's talking about AI and other people will give ideas. And I have lots of ideas and thoughts about AI, how to use it badly, how to use it well. But I'm sure your listeners will have heard lots of different angles on that recently. And maybe I'll give you a slightly different, interesting one, which is arbitrage. So for me, as we have a more global community, and it's only becoming more and more global, there's two types of people managing projects. There's people managing projects who can get in person, right? They live locally, they can get teams together, they're not flying, they don't have to fly all over the world to get their team together. And those people have some ability to bring some incredibly powerful human tools to play just by being physically in the same room with other people. So I think those people, those managers will still have well-paid jobs, will be able to deliver very, very good outcomes, and they'll use those tools. Unfortunately, some of those people who live in rich countries want to work from home all the time, and they don't want to go into the office, and they don't want to use those tools and get the post-it notes out and have the coffee actually face to face. Those people, I think, are going to struggle, because what's happening is there's millions of incredibly hardworking, incredibly intelligent people who now can offer exactly the same service and ability that those guys, in America or in Ireland or in the UK, and need to be paid a lot of money to do the job. They can do the same thing from India or the Philippines or Africa. And actually, I think what's going to happen is we'll see a divergence of pay for people managing teams, in that people who are going to maintain high levels of pay, they need to be present. That's not every day necessarily, but they need to have that ability to interact in a human way. And everybody else will have a rush to probably not the bottom, right? It's probably still, there's a level of education and there's those kind of things, but they're competing in a much more cutthroat environment. So my advice to people would be, go and meet people. Have a real coffee, not a virtual one. And with that, you might be more likely to stick around in the high-paying job in the high-cost country than if you don't do that.
Yeah, the global connection, I think, brings an extra level of competitiveness, doesn't it? So that's for sure. So look, you've shared some great advice and insights here, James. Thanks so much indeed for your time. Unfortunately, it brings us to the end of this episode of VistaTalks. I want to thank our audience around the world, everybody who's watching or listening to us today. And if you want to find out more, you can reach out to James. You can go and check out his book. I'm sure it's on Amazon and all the great bookstores that you can get it from. And go and check out what he's doing with his community, particularly if you're in the project management space. And as James says, we're all project managers at this stage. So go and find out what James is doing. But James, thanks. Go
as a
ahead.
special little offer, I'll just throw it in there, right? If anybody connects with me on LinkedIn and then mention the podcast and just say, please, could I have a copy of the audiobook? I'll send you a free version.
There's a great offer. Thanks, James. That's great for our listeners around the world. I'm sure you'll have some takers up for that. Listen, thanks, James. It's been great to talk to you today. I hope everybody can join me back here for another episode of VistaTalks, where once again I'll be meeting some interesting people and having some interesting discussions with people just like James. But thanks, James. Real pleasure to talk to you again today.
Real pleasure, Simon. Thanks ever so much.